Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend Colin. The world of technology and healthcare are ever-changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news, meshed together in new ways, which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. On today's episode, we'll be discussing access to medical records, a hot topic. And be sure to follow the show on Twitter at the hashtag HITSM and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 13 years of health IT blog content at healthcareittoday.com. Ready to talk about access to medical records, a hot topic?
Yeah, it's going to be quite fun today. It's definitely something that has been in the news and always a perennial hot topic at conferences when we talk when it comes up.
It becomes heated, especially with patients who want access or don't want access, or doctors who want it. Anyway, we'll get into that.
We'll get into totally. And we've got 4 topics to cover today. So we're going to talk initially about, is access to records actually useful or useless for patients? That is sometimes a debate. Then we'll move into talking about, can the challenge of access actually be solved? Then we'll dive into, where are we in terms of the standards for access and sharing information with patients or just within organizations? And then who should or shouldn't have access to medical records? Those are the topics for today, John.
Excellent.
All right, so let's dive right in. Is access to records useful or useless for patients?
Yes. That's such a cop-out answer, but here's the problem. I think we all agree that patients should have access to their records. It's their right to have access to the records, and they should have access to it. And that's been a culture change that I think has been challenging for many in the healthcare systems that have been around for a long time, because they look at it and say, well, why would you want access, or what's the purpose of your access, or what are you going to do with it, right? And some of it's fear, somewhat unfounded. I think we've proven that out over many organizations who have given access to the records, but some of it is just culture. Just for years, they just don't understand why you would need it or why you'd want it. And so, we're butting up against these years of, hey, we just store the information and we'll take care of you and you don't need to worry about it. And now we're having more access, more patients that are interested in access because they want to be proactive in their healthcare. So I guess, I think that fundamentally access is a right that patients should have. And so we should do it whether it's useful or not. But then on the other side, the question is, how useful is that data? And I think many doctors who say you're not going to get any value out of accessing this data is true for a lot of patients. And I think it's true for a lot of patients who don't want to spend the time to understand what it means. But that doesn't mean because a lot of them it's not useful, we shouldn't do it for the patients that it is useful.
Huh. That's an interesting take. I mean, I'm going to take it from a slightly different angle and say that I think access to medical records with the current crop of technologies and the current methods of access is completely useless for most patients. I mean, it's just basically a data dump. It's stuff on a screen. It's a PDF. It's not really that useful. And for that reason, I think it's very useless for most patients, except for the ones that are, dealing with chronic conditions or who are having to, shuttle between different specialists who are not within the same system. It's funny. I actually think that the need for access was really driven home or really came about because health systems had gotten so big. I mean, in the old days, right, if you were just a single hospital with, the associated family physician, the records flowed pretty easily between the two, and it was okay that you as a patient didn't have access because, it did work. But as systems got bigger and as you were sort of shuttled to say, okay, I got to go see this physician over here, and then I got to see this facility over here, and the hospitals didn't actually do the integration. Now the patient had to. And so I think nowadays, access is critical because otherwise there's no way all the information goes between all of those people you need to see. So I think I agree with you, John. I think it's even though it might be useless because of either the technology and the way we're allowing for access, it still doesn't absolve us from the fact that we should grant it.
But is it possible to make it useful? Like that's the, and I shouldn't say possible because anything's possible, but is it reasonable to put it on the providers to say, hey, can you change this data into, as one person on the blog said when we were discussing this, how do you change data into information, right? So right now we're just giving them this data dump, but how do we get that so it's information that's actionable and useful for the patient? And is that a reasonable expectation for our providers to do?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I don't think in today's world it's reasonable to expect a provider or a clinician to do this. But I could have said the same thing years ago with financial data, right? I mean, if you dumped to me banking data way back in the day, other than my savings account balance, I probably wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it. But over time, banks realize that, hey, there's an advantage to having financial advisors, to having people whose sole job it is to interpret these mountains of data, like market data, research data, your own, financial data, and interpret it and feed it back to you as a service. I don't think we're there yet in medicine. I'm not sure we'll ever be there, but if we actually had access to all of the information, you could see that some entrepreneurs may decide, hey, there's a business model here where I could take all your data, interpret it for you, and feed it back in a more useful interpreted way.
Yeah, well, and I actually love that we're even able to have this conversation today because back in the paper world, there was a cost associated with sharing the data. And so very few people wanted to even incur the cost to be able to get the data. And now it's basically free to be able to share the data electronically. And so because it's so inexpensive to share electronic, we can have this discussion. Whereas 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we'd be like, well, yeah, sure, we'd share it, but you got to pay the copy cost, you got to pay the postage cost, and some people did, but a lot of people said, forget it, I don't need it that bad.
Well, actually, that brings us to the next topic, and it's a nice segue, John. So, can actually the challenge of access be solved? Or has it been solved in your mind?
It certainly hasn't been solved. That's the easy question. At least when you hear all of these stories of patients that want access to their data and they're not able to get it, or people invoking HIPAA, I can't share that with you inappropriately. Most of the time, I don't think we've solved it in any way, shape, or form from the patient perspective, but also from the provider perspective. I don't think the providers have access to the information they would like to have from other organizations. And you're right, we've seen a proliferation of care providers, whether it's specialists, whether it's surgery centers, whether it's quick care, whether it's retail care, whether it's virtual care, where that's growing huge in telemedicine. All of those areas now need to be integrated, and it's a much wider surface area that needs to be able to solve this problem. So I don't think we're anywhere near it. The question that you pose, though, is really interesting. Can it be solved? My gut reaction on this is that in the current reimbursement system, it can't. So I don't think in our current reimbursement system there's the motivation to solve it, and so I don't think it will be, which means that in my mind it can't be solved. But that said, could we do better than we're doing today? And I think the answer to that is yes. We should solve in more ways, even if it's not going to be the perfect longitudinal record that always is where it needs to be, when it needs to be, with whatever provider it needs to be across every system. Like, that's unrealistic. But is it realistic that we do better than we're doing today? Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I think in the current environment, the way things are, the financial incentives, the structures that we have in place, the infrastructure or the lack of infrastructure that we have, I don't think the problem is solvable until one of these things changes. And at least one, anyways. I know we're trying to address the infrastructure. We've got a lot of new standards, whether it's HL7 fire or we've also got some legislation that's coming through to end information blocking, to grant access or gain access. But of course, that doesn't go as far to actually say, well, what's in the record. Like what do you actually have access to? Do I actually have access to the images? Do I not? Do I have access to the notes? Do I not? It's unclear. So we are working towards it, but I would agree with you. In the current way that things are in the healthcare system, I can't see us solving this problem where we have that longitudinal record. I think we could get to the day where we can have access. I think the question then becomes is what do we do with it? Like we're going to have to figure out some way to consolidate it. You know, just because I have access to 7 different systems to get all my data doesn't really mean I have what I need.
Sure.
Right? So
this is interesting though, like because we're talking from a very U.S. perspective, which largely most of our discussions are U.S. based. But you live in Canada. Is this problem solved in Canada, or can it be solved in Canada? I mean, you're single payer, right? I mean, that's what Medicare for All wants is the Canadian system, maybe. Or something.
I mean, I think until a couple of weeks ago, I would have said the advantage that we have was, we do have a single patient ID that can identify you, so it's at least possible to gather and find all your information a little bit easier. But other than that, no, we have multiple systems and systems don't talk to each other, and it's left up to the patient to really be the consolidator of all their health records.
Wait, so the national patient ID didn't just solve that, magically?
No, it just made it possible to solve. It doesn't actually mean it's solvable. We have the same thing where I can get my claims data pretty easily, but that doesn't tell me doesn't give me the whole picture.
That's interesting, though, to think that you can get the claims data. I mean, that is one part of the picture that's important that even in the U.S. we can't really solve.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. So no, I think it'll be interesting because I think it ultimately it is possible to solve this problem of access. I just think that once we get past the technology and the infrastructure hurdles, we then get into, well, what kind of access do I need? Do I have the ability to update it? Do I have access to the full record? What parts are private? What parts are public? Who can I grant access? I mean, there's all of these challenges. I mean, we haven't even solved this in other industries, right? I mean, I can't really control who has access to my financial records. I mean, people can just do a query if I'm renting a place versus, I'm assigning for a credit card, right? Like, I really can't control it. So have too high of an expectation on the health side, where we want to be able to dole that out as a patient to say, okay, I grant you access, but not you. Not sure. I mean, but that's exciting actually to be in a spot where we can even start to talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah, but interoperability is a problem in so many industries that don't want to work together, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's the problem is when people finally decide, hey, we want to work together, we solve the problem. I mean, I think we saw that with the cell phone industry. They finally were pushed far enough that said, hey, I need to solve this problem or I'm going to get in trouble. And now I can swap a SIM card. I can move my phone number. I can do all of those things without a problem. So I think that's part of the challenge. I think it's also worth bringing up a perspective that probably, for me is always inspired by our colleague Erin Gilmer, who many of you might know on Twitter, and she would bring up the challenge that, hey, as a patient, I'm not sure I want interoperability. And for her perspective is pretty unique. I think for most patients, we're like, yeah, share away. If it's for my care, it's going to improve my care, go for it. But she has a very complex set of past history of chronic conditions, of past abuse, of past bad experiences with the healthcare organizations, and so even with some mental health challenges as well. And so when you look at a situation like that, she doesn't want access to all of her health info to all of her doctors, which I think goes to your point, which is, hey, it's one thing to be able to have access. It's another thing to be able to enable the patient to be able to decide who has access to what and when. And that's a much larger goal that I think would fit Erin's goal, which is, hey, yeah, I want certain people to have access to certain things, but there's certain, some things I need to keep, for my psychiatrist. And that's where it gets super complicated. And we haven't even talked about kids. Like, forget about that. That's even more challenging.
Let's go on to the next topic. So where are we in terms of standards for access and sharing?
Oh man, the standards part just kills me, right? It's just hard. I mean, at the end of the day, we have some standards. We have CCD, which most patients say is useless, right? If you get a CCDA document from your hospital health system, it's in a standard format that you can't do anything with, right? It's not human readable really. It's so full of bloat and full of other stuff that's not useful to you that it just makes it useless in large respects. So, some people are using it, and hopefully we'll layer on some systems on top of it that will pull out the nuggets of usefulness. Um, Fire has, more hope. I think we're seeing some progress with Fire, and I think we're seeing some access through Fire that is, giving us some hope. My problem with Fire is I'm not sure it scales to the full health data. I think it will work in very targeted applications, similar to the way other interoperability technologies worked in the past. I mean, the ADT transactions, doing financial transactions. I mean, there's companies sending millions and millions of interoperable transactions using ADT type of technology that's been very successful. And so I think Fire will do the same for a certain set of clinical data, but it's not going to scale all the way to the full medical record. And my fear is, kind of back to question two, similarly, is that even possible? Because the level of complexity in health data and the non-standard way that everyone documents, even or doctors that were trained the same way, working at the same health system, still document so differently. I'm not even sure it's possible. So, I don't know where that leaves us standards wise.
Yeah, I think we are pretty far from a single standard. I think we have some interesting frameworks that are available, like HLS on Fire. But we've also got some older ones that just were equally fantastic when they were introduced, but just have not gotten the traction. Where I'm interested in where this is going is, of course, we do have laws now that talk about information blocking and how you can't do that. I actually think it's actually the market forces that are going to cause more of the sharing and more of the standard adoption versus the legislation. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the new treatments, a lot of the new ways that providers are organizing themselves, you're going to have to be interoperable. You're going to have to be able to share data between multiple parties, right? Whether that's patient-generated data, or whether that's with someone who's slightly outside the network, that you work with or that you're affiliated with, whether it's with a long-term care facility. I mean, we're getting to the point where, because of value-based care, you're going to have to play with other parties. And as healthcare gets more and more fragmented in terms of more and more specialized, like for example, like with the new genomic medicine or personalized medicine, we're going to have to figure this out, because that's the only way that the care is actually going to be provided, or that's the only way the information is going to come. So I think we're going to get there quicker because of those market forces in terms of a useful standard, as opposed to all this legislation and stuff and pushing by patients. I mean, it's great that we have a voice, but unfortunately, I think the incentive is coming from really the other side.
Yeah, I still go back to something I thought about many years ago. And it's like, well, if Epic and Cerner just said, here's the standard you can share with us, then we'd have a standard for for a lot of the healthcare system, right? I mean, I guess there's something to that, right? And I agree with you that the market really should drive the standards, because then it would be based on use cases that actually need to be implemented, rather than some pie in the sky idea that, hey, we could solve all this problems with the standard. I just don't think that's going to work, right? We need actual use cases where it makes sense for healthcare organizations to share, and then I think I was going to say happily implement, but that might be a little exaggerated. They will implement, happily or not.
And that brings us to our fourth topic, John. So who should or shouldn't have access to medical records?
Man, some of this goes back to the discussion, that Aaron brought up. In my view, I'm an open guy, and I kind of stole this from Brad Feld, this venture capitalist in Boulder. And he said, I've kind of assumed that my privacy is gone. he's like, no, I don't want to be flippant. I don't want to be crazy about it, but I kind of come from it, from the perspective. It's like, I just assume that everyone's going to have access to all my information, and I just have to live my life that way. And I think we can be careful and thoughtful. But anyway, that's my own personal take, which I think many, especially of the younger generation, are taking a similar approach. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves from a patient perspective and what they're okay with or not okay with. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a challenging thing. I think in the recent news, seeing the company Patients Like Me be acquired by a payer, United Healthcare, is interesting, and I see a lot of patients, and they're fearful of that, and for good reason. I mean, it's not like the payers have been really patient centric, right? Especially with the data, they have to worry about their bottom line, and that's what they do. That's what a publicly traded company does, for good or bad, and that's kind of maybe a topic for another discussion. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging question, but the real goal should be have the patient control it. But is that realistic? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept, right? If you centralize the control to anybody, whether it's a patient, which is probably the right person or the most incented, or whether it's a third party like a payer or your provider, the problem is, of course, that with healthcare data, access can, what happens in an emergency situation? What if that person's not reachable? How do you grant access, right? Like it gets into some problems which don't exist in other industries, right? Where it's literally a life and death situation. So it's interesting, this whole notion of control versus knowledge, right? Like for me, I'm like you, I I I agree that privacy is starting to be redefined, especially by the younger generation. But at least I'd want to know who accessed my information. Maybe I can't control who had, but at least I'd want to know. Oh, hey, look, a drug company got access to is using your information for a study. Your insurance company is using it for this reason, or this other, your physician needed it for this. And having whether it's a blockchain ledger or some other thing that tracks it, it would be beneficial for me to know, oh, this is what my information is being used. Or at least I know who has access. But in terms of who shouldn't have access, I think most people would go, look, as long as there's a fair trade, you're accessing my information and I'm getting something in return, or society is getting something in return, then I think most people would be okay with that. If my data is accessed for a study on cancer, or is it being accessed for a study on something related to some other medication, I think I'd be all right with that. But if it's used to for my employer to use it against me, then I probably wouldn't be okay with that. But anyway, for me it starts with more of who. It's not so much who should or shouldn't have access. It's really more, how can I know who has been accessing my records?
Hmm. That's a beautiful way to describe it. The only challenge is that's more art than it is science, right? As far as the value exchange that happens. And a lot of that has to do with perspective as much as it has to do with reality. And businesses are really good at abusing that principle. And that's, I think, one of the challenges that comes up. I think doctors, when they look at it, I've heard this from some other perspectives, so I'm applying it in kind of a different way. But I think they're fine. Like, hey, don't give us access to your information, but also don't hold us liable when we don't give you the care that you want, right? So, I think there's an interesting balance there, especially in the litigious U.S. Framework, that doctors are like, I don't necessarily need your information, but don't hold me liable when you had information that could have helped me treat you better, and I didn't give you the treatment you deserved and that you needed because you withheld the information from me, or I didn't have access to it. So, there are some tricky frameworks there from a legal perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, the whole legal side is something we can debate with our friends, Matt and Dave, ad nauseum. It's such an interesting area, confusing, frankly. But yeah, for me, again, I go back to, for me, it starts with, look, I'm not sure we're at even the point of being able to control, but at least let's get to the point of knowing who. And
Yeah.
I think that's where most of the fear comes from, is not so much, I want control. It's really more, I fear who has access and who's looking at this stuff that I have no knowledge of. And of course, once we get there, then we can start dealing with okay, well, how do they get access? How do I prevent that access, and so forth. So in terms of who should or shouldn't, I think most people would be okay with, funny enough, I think payers, as long as there was some benefit to the patients, whether that through treatment plans or better credit coordination. I think the bigger fear is more around employers and drug companies, being able to target ads sort of in the annoying side, but also employers just in terms of, not, whether it's related to promotion or, you're next up on the pink slips. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of potential problems right there.
Well, and we see the U.S. government is putting out a consumer health data law, or they're considering it. There's been bills that have started. So, if we don't get our hands around it, I think the government's going to get their hands around it. And I'm not sure that's a good outcome.
And that, John, brings us to the end of another episode. So thanks to all of you who tuned in today to this episode of Healthcare IT Today. Find out more details about our show, just check out the programs page on healthcarenowradio.com, and share your voice and engage with the community at healthcareittoday.com or on Twitter using the hashtag HITSM. I'm Colin Hung with my friend and health IT collaborator John Lynn. Thanks for listening and have a great week.